toka mwanzo pande ya Lamu, wakatuharibia utalii wetu, wakatuletea madhara ya kuua sasa watu wetu kwa makanisa, wapi na kila pahali.
Kuna wengi nchini Kenya ambao wanajiuliza mpaka leo kwa nini KDF ibaki Somalia. Kuna madhara mengi ambayo yangekuwa yametokea nchini Kenya ambayo tumewahi kuyazuia kwa kuwa nchini Somalia.
Please keep your spirits high. Please keep the morale and tempo, knowing that what you do each and every day is not only recognized but fully appreciated. Na tutafanya sisi lolote kuhakikisha ya kwamba tumewasaidia na tumewasimamia kwa njia yeyote.
I've created FaceTime this morning with Professor Naomi Damba, who's the Vice Chancellor of KCA University and also an expert on defense and foreign policy. Also, we have Dr. Momo Nzau. He's a governance and strategist, security strategist. Also, we have with us Captain Collins Wanderi, who's an advocate and a security analyst. Dr. Apollos Mashera, criminologist from Egerton University, and Dr. Mustafa Yusuf Ali, who is a conflict and resolution expert and also national security expert as well. Gentlemen, we continue this discussion from the president into Somalia. You know, what a gesture there, bolstering the morale or boosting the morale of our soldiers in Somalia. Let's begin with you, Professor Naomi Damba.
The bar symbolic representation is very important. The president gesture is required, and the top government officers, in order to boost the morale of soldiers and also really demonstrate commitment. Now, we are in a peculiar situation here that we as a country need to consider very carefully. Number one, the attempt of the US to cut major funding that will boost security and all others will have significant impact, particularly on war against Al-Shabaab. Europe is withdrawing quietly from the role that we have depended on for a long time. And as you can see, Japanese are going back.
Yes, Japanese
going back to Japan.
Yes,
now,
they're actually going this year.
Yes, correct. Now, will Africa, and I'm talking about the continent of Africa, has the appetite and the resources to fight this kind of war?
All right.
And therefore, we really need a Kenyan practical strategy. And I've been saying this for a long time, that we need to buffer our borders, make sure that our borders are you know, which is very porous right now,
yes,
are buffed from inside and outside.
Right, and I think, of course, I've misled our viewers. It's not really, they're not really backing from Somalia, but from South Sudan. That is the Japanese soldiers as well. Let's say from Dr. Momo Nzau.
Yes. Most important is to acknowledge the gesture by the head of state by visiting, you know, as commander-in-chief, the troops across the border, serving under AMISOM. It is not purely a KDF affair. It is an African affair. It is the AMISOM troops. And I was also a little bit, well, I thought the judgment in one of the newspapers about his State of Nation address on the matter of security, national security and safety and security, where they said truly, what did they say, mostly false, was not right, because they were passing a judgment based on, you know, attacks that were attacks at El Ade and at the battle at Kulbi War. By the way, Kenya Defense Forces won the battle at Kulbi War. So it was an attack on the Kenya Defense Forces, but it was thwarted and so what I'm saying is that we should not fault our state machinery in terms of matters of defense.
Thank you.
And pass a judgment on the head of state based on that. It's wrong.
Okay, let's just give a quick cursory look on this, because we have a lot to cover as well. But looking also at what we have on the front page of the East African this week, especially with the aid from USA, and of course their big cards, their Trump budget cuts to hurt UN work in Africa and also the mission in Somalia, and also war on climate change as well. But it's a boon for Kenya as well, because we have also some good monies or grants really coming to fight climate change. But what does this portend as well? Because AMISOM, as it is right now, is underfunded. And we saw there was a gesture from Rwanda that they've committed themselves also to be regularly, disbursing, their funds to AMISOM, of which other countries have not been faithfully doing. Captain Wanderi.
Yeah, and the world is unfortunately getting weary and tired of the conflicts in Africa.
Yes.
And because there are other flashpoints in the world which attract greater attention to them. Whereas the conflicts in Africa do not have an overflow into Europe and America, the conflicts in Asia, particularly in Asia Minor, Syria and Afghanistan, they have, of course, led to migrants into Europe. And that becomes a major concern for them. That's a bigger issue to them than the conflicts in Africa. And therefore, this fatigue in funding African missions and restoration of peace in Africa will, of course, see a reduction in terms of funding, which is risky, because what happens is that when there is absence of control and security, you then create space for other kind of militias and militants to take root.
Yes.
And we have seen in Libya, the collapse of the state in Libya has destabilized not just Libya. It has destabilized Niger, it has destabilized Mali, it has destabilized even Chad. Now it has destabilized Nigeria as well as Cameroon. That is the after effect of the collapse of the state in Libya. So one of the critical issues that African leaders must now think is how to ensure that, how to reduce internal conflicts and to ensure that political conflicts do not lead to armed conflict. Like we saw in South Sudan, what started as a political disagreement between Dr. Riek Machar and President Salva Kiir ended up becoming an internal armed conflict. That is, we also know that was the genesis in Somalia. We saw that kind of problems for a long time between Eritrea and the then Ethiopian Empire. And then we also saw a bit of that immediately, the collapse of the Dag regime and the departure of Haile Mengistu Mariam. We also had a series of armed insurrections inside Ethiopia. So I think African leaders are being called upon to think outside the box, that these conflicts, you got to have to put your house in order. Because if you do not, the world is getting tired. And we must also see that, even as you mentioned, Japan is withdrawing from South Sudan.
Yes.
That's the reason. Japan has only 350 security forces, what they call the Japanese Self-Defense Forces in South Sudan. And mainly their work has been concentrated on building infrastructure in support of the government of South Sudan. But now they are saying, we no longer can sustain this mission because of your prolonged conflict. We, in fact, opt to get out, then we support you in terms of humanitarian aid, in terms of food and sanitation. That is something that African leaders now need to grapple with, because if the world gets tired of Africa and the world withdraws, then, and we are not able to secure our borders, as Professor Midaba said, then we start the risk of having militants, like we've seen in Northwest Africa and the Maghreb, taking root in Africa.
Thank you. Right. Very briefly from Dr.
I think leaders in Africa should realize that African solutions to African challenges. That's why Africa is shaped like a question mark. We have the answer. So we should stop. Yeah, we have the answer. We should stop relying on Donald Trump, because Donald Trump behaves like a giraffe. Terrorism does not happen in America. He has forgotten 9/11. He has forgotten the Istanbul and Brussels and Paris. Now they think Africans, they can, because if he reduces the funding, we shall cater for ourselves. I think Kenya should cater for ourselves in Mandela, in Boni Forest.
Right.
And
thank you.
Uganda does the same, Sudan does the same. Then,
Okay, Dr. Mustafa.
Yeah, Dibal, first of all, two very quick points here is that these conflicts in Africa, the African leaders need to be very serious about prevention and not waiting until conflicts become violent. That's when then they are getting in. Was messy, unpredictable.
Yes.
and expensive. And it's going to be very difficult if, or it's going to be extremely difficult for African countries to continue messing around and paying for the wars that are ongoing on the continent. And this is why we've had to depend on the EU, European Union, the United States of America. Trump is going to definitely cut the aid that is going towards the United Nations, and that's partly what is used to maintain some of these peacekeepers. And that is going to be very difficult for a number of African countries that have been depending on this aid. We have to wisen up. The African Union has got to wisen up, and we need to have more visionary leaders who are going to address the challenges of insecurity. It was very timely that the President of the Republic of Kenya, Uhuru Kenyatta, visiting as a commander-in-chief of the Kenya Armed Forces, visiting the Kenyan contingent within AMISOM in Somalia.
All right, thank you. Maybe you want to wind up on that Somalia brief. Should we pull out or not? Professor Naomi Dama, let me just give you this opportunity.
Kenya cannot afford to pull out of Somalia. Kenya need realignment, regrouping, strategically to make sure that our borders are closed from unwanted individuals. Secondly, we need to have enough intelligence inside Somalia. That does not require massive ground forces, but real intelligence and real time. I said before, we need to have a buffer zone, 50-kilometer buffer zone that should not be crossed by any armed group approaching our border.
Thank you.
Let me just make very quickly, because this is something that Kenya is doing for Somalia. We have been under AMISOM for the last week training newly elected members of parliament from Somalia, from Jubaland State. And it's part of a series that AMISOM is doing here. Apart from the military work, we have been training them on legislation and governance issues for the past week, and it is going to be continuing to other states within the Federal Republic of Somalia.
Thank you.